Hello grade 12s, welcome to today's lesson. It's Economics with Ms. Piwe. Today we will be focusing on inflation, looking at your cost push inflation, also the important terminology that goes with inflation. So let's get started. So what is inflation? So let's start off by defining what inflation is. So we know that inflation occurs when there is a sustained and significant increase in general price levels over a period of time. So this over here is actually a definition of what inflation is. So we're looking at a sustained and significant increase in general price levels over a period of time. So it has to happen within a specific period of time, but also it has to be a significant increase in the general price levels. At the same time, there is a decline in the buying power of money. In other words, the general price levels increases more than the general increase in the wages or the salaries of households. So there is less disposable income for households in order to purchase their consumer goods and services. Okay, so we can see there's a decline in that regard. So it's important that you note, as a result of the general increase in prices, the buying power of money will be compromised because the increase happens more than the general increase in wages and also in salaries. So some important concepts that we need to consider when looking at inflation. So these definitions, remember, they will help you to understand the meaning of key economic concepts that are used in this lesson. So it is important that we understand these concepts well. Okay, so starting off with the administered prices. So that would be our number one over there. So these are the prices that are set and controlled by government. So government is the one that's going to determine these prices. So they are set and controlled by government. And then over here, we are dealing with the concept of core inflation. It excludes items from the CPI, our consumer price index basket that we referred to in our previous lesson, that are highly volatile and also prices affected by government policy. We call that core inflation. And then with cost push inflation will be number 3 over there. Occurs when there is an increase in the general price levels caused by an increase in the cost of production. So the increase there is as a result of the cost of production. So when there's an increase in the cost of production, that will result in the increase of general price levels, and we call that cost push inflation. Moving on to number 4 over here, we've got the consumer price index. We did look at that in our previous lesson more extensively. So what is a consumer price index? So it is an index that measures the price of a fixed basket of consumer goods and services. It relates to the cost of living, so it's important to mention that. And the basket consists of consumer goods and services. Also important to note, capital and intermediate goods are excluded. So these are excluded in the basket that we keep on referring to. And then the prices include the value added tax. Interest rates are taken into account. And then also we have the prices of imported goods and services, which are not shown over here. All right. So these are also excluded over here. And that is the consumer price index. Then moving on to the demand pull inflation, that would be our number 5. So it occurs when there's an aggregate demand for goods and services, or when the aggregate demand of goods and services actually exceeds the aggregate supply of goods and services. Okay. So when there's a difference between the aggregate demand for goods and services compared to the aggregate demand or the aggregate supply of goods and services, we call that the demand pull inflation. Then moving on to headline inflation, these are unadjusted CPI figures. Remember, CPI, our Consumer Price Index, we've just looked at that. That was our number 4. So these will be the unadjusted figures of the CPI, and we call that the headline inflation. Okay, and then we have the hyperinflation over here. This is the inflation rate above 50%. So people lose confidence in the value of money and they start the bartering of goods and services. And this actually happened in Zimbabwe many years ago. They dealt with the whole issue of the hyperinflation because the inflation got to the point where it was above 50%, and then the people lost confidence in the value of the money. Then they started going back to the bartering of goods and services. And then inflation as a concept, we did look at that earlier on. When we started this lesson, we said it is a sustained and significant increase in the general price levels over a period of time, and it also simultaneously, meaning at the same time, causes a decline in the buying power of money. So the buying power of money is also compromised. And then moving on, looking at the inflation targeting. So it forms part of the monetary policy and is managed by the Reserve Bank in order to keep the inflation within the range as set by the Minister of Finance. So we know that it is between 3% and 6%, and we know that this is part of the monetary policy, and the Monetary Committee actually ensures that the inflation stays within those targeted areas of 3% and 6%. Then moving on to the Monetary Policy Committee, I've just mentioned that, fortunately, consists of the Governor of the Reserve Bank. So he is part of this committee that actually ensures that we keep our inflation targeting. And it also has the 3 deputy governors and also another 3 members. So they form the MPC, which is the Monetary Policy Committee. The main purpose of this is to determine an interest rate that will be consistent with meeting the inflation target. Hence, you get that media briefing. You will hear that at 11 o'clock, the governor of the Reserve Bank will make an announcement whether the interest rates will increase or decrease. So that is a decision that is made by the Monetary Policy Committee, which is made out of the governor of the Reserve Bank, the 3 deputy governors and another 3 members. So they sit and they actually determine the interest rate that will be consistent with meeting the inflation target. And then we move on, and now we look at the Producer Price Index, which is the PPI. We did look at that during our previous lesson, but let's just recap on that. So it assesses the impact of changes in the relative weighting of production inputs. So pertains to the cost of production. The basket consists of goods only, and then we have the capital and intermediate goods that are included. And remember, on our previous point, we said that they were not included. And then prices exclude value-added tax, and also the interest rates are excluded. Prices of imported goods are shown explicitly. So as you compare to what we said with the PPI or the CPI over here, we said that the capital and intermediate goods are excluded, but now we see that they are excluded. And here we spoke of the value-added tax, which was included. And then we said the prices of imported goods are not shown. But now we see that over here they are shown, and that value-added tax is excluded. And then also the interest rates are excluded. And that's with the PPI, which is the Producer Price Index. And the stagflation, which is the low growth and high unemployment and high inflation rates that occurs at the same time. So it's quite a disaster when there's slow or low economic growth happening. We are dealing with an issue of high unemployment, but also with high inflation rates all happening at the same time. So not an ideal situation. So we hope not to ever find ourselves in this particular situation. Right, now that we've gone over those important concepts, it's time that we now do some application of these importance that we have just, the important concepts that we have just mentioned. So we'll start off with measuring inflation. It's important that you are able to define, explain, and examine as well, because it is an important section in the paper. And also it's just a very important topic in just general business conversation that actually happens. In most cases, people often talk about inflation and the role that it plays in terms of economic growth and stability as well. So we start off with the price indexes that we looked at when we looked at the economic indicators in our previous lesson. So these are used to measure the changes in the general price level. So the following important concepts related to measuring inflation. So an index is a price index or indexes. A price index is compiled by using prices of a representative range of goods and services which are recorded on a regular basis. Okay, so you will record this range of prices from different goods and services, and then from that you'll be able to have information regarding the price index. And then also we have the weighting that actually happens. So this will be the difference in the importance of items in an index. Okay, let's just go over it again. So this is the difference in the importance of items in an index is solved through a weighting or a weighted index which reflects the relative importance of each item. So when we are doing the weighting, so we're going to look at the importance of items in an index. You know, what value or significance do they have when we are looking at the index, okay? And then they reflect the relative importance of each item. So it's important that you look at items individually and the significance that they bring into the index as well. Then we have the inflation rate. We often hear people talking about the inflation rate. So the inflation rate is there to determine, or the rate is, it determines, or it's there to determine the changes in the CPI or the PPI. So the figures for each month are compared to the corresponding month in the previous year in order to determine what the current inflation rate is. So there is a comparison that gets done when we are looking at what the inflation rate is. And then the inflation targeting, we said that the Reserve Bank plays an important role in the inflation targeting, and also the Monetary Policy Committee, the MPC, will meet, and then they will then determine what the interest rates are for that particular financial year. So it forms part of monetary policy, and it's set by government and is managed by the Reserve Bank to keep the inflation within the range as set by the Minister of Finance, which is between 3 and 6%. And then also the aim of inflation targeting is to keep the inflation rate at low and more stable levels. Okay, so quite an important aspect of the monetary policy. So what are the types of inflation that we often come across? So there are two main types of inflation. We have the demand pull inflation, and then we also have the cost push inflation, and we are going to explain them now. Starting with, let's go back over here. just to make sure that we have covered all our points under the slide. So we have, so let's move on to the next one. So starting with the consumer inflation, we will look at the headline inflation. It is measured by the CPI and is calculated for urban areas only. So the rural communities are excluded when we are looking at headline inflation. It represents the cost of a shopping basket of goods and services of a typical South African household. So you look at a typical South African household, you look at their shopping basket, and therefore you'll be able to calculate what the CPI is of that particular household. So Stats SA identifies 1,500 different consumer goods or services, assigns a weight to each, and then decides on a base year, on formula, and also on the collection of prices. So the unadjusted CPI rate is known as the headline inflation. Okay, so here they will identify 1,500 different consumer goods or services. Then they will assign a weight to each, and then they'll decide on the base year, also on formula, and also on the collection prices. And then the unadjusted CPI will be known as the headline inflation. Okay, so it's important to know that definition as well. So moving right along, so that is the headline inflation. Now we move on to the core inflation. It is published by the Stats SA, Statistics South Africa, and excludes items from the CPI basket with highly volatile prices and those affected by government intervention and also by policy. For example, fresh and frozen meat and fish as well will fall under that category. Vegetables, interest rates on mortgage bonds, and also value-added tax and the assessment rates will be examples of such. So we call that core inflation, where you look at the information that is published by Stats SA, and it excludes items from the CPI basket with highly volatile prices, which are affected by government intervention, policy, and so on. So we will call this the core inflation, and then those are the items that are examples of such. So before we continue looking at more examples of inflation, let's take a short break, and I will see you right after this.